And with that, I'm going to bring up Randall Gabrielle, and he's going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Welcome to the program of the April meeting of the Middletown Township Historical Society. Before I introduce our speaker, TJ Fallon, I have one important historic announcement to make. In 2 weekends, the first weekend in May, there is the self-guided tour, a weekend in Old Monmouth, sponsored by the Monmouth County Historical Commission. 50 sites throughout the county are open for 12 hours that weekend, many of them here in Middletown and in the surrounding area. Make a note to visit it. You can get the program, the tour book at any of the historic sites, or you can see a copy online before you go at the county website, visitmonmouth.com. We are pleased to have TJ Fallon speak to us tonight. His favorite historic haunt is cemeteries. Now, a lot of us like cemeteries to search for, say, dead ancestors or even historical figures. But TJ has started with a particular interest, the graves of presidents, done as a pastime during the pandemic. Now, that's an interesting and important subject, but there are only so many of them. You can complete your tour, and the additions are far and few between. So he expanded into vice presidents, some of them truly obscure and forgotten, unless they happen to say something outrageous, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and who knows what else. Cemeteries is TJ's passion. He's going to make the dead come alive for us. So TJ, please take the podium.
Thank you so much for that very interesting introduction. So yes, my name is TJ Fallon. I guess you could say that cemeteries are my hobby. You probably expect when you hear something like that to see some morbid person up here who looks very strange, but this all happened just kind of by chance, to be completely honest with you. I will get into that here in a second. Am I going the wrong way? Did I go the wrong way? Yes, I did. So the title of this is Sic Transit Gloria Mundi. I cannot take credit for that. So the Asbury Park Press actually did an article on me back in 2020, and the man who wrote the article, that's what he named it. And the translation from Latin is, "Thus passes the glory of the world," which I love. It's actually probably going to go on my tombstone one day, because I think it's very interesting, very poetic. So just to tell you a little bit about myself. So you can see up here I have a YouTube channel, an Instagram. You can see my logos. It's got all sorts of crazy stuff on it. I have not been visiting cemeteries since I was a 5-year-old little boy. That's not the way this all happened. Just to give you an idea, in 2020, I was furloughed from my job during the pandemic, like a lot of people were throughout the country. And after about a month, I was bored out of my mind. I had cabin fever. So I started to think, well, what in the heck can I do that is safe, socially distanced, maybe get outside? And I thought this crazy idea, well, you know what? You know where nobody's going to be? Cemeteries. Well, at least nobody that's alive is going to be there. So I actually Googled famous people that are buried in the state of New Jersey. And I found, of course, the Whitney Houstons and the Yogi Berras and people like that. And then I saw on the list President Grover Cleveland, who's buried in Princeton, New Jersey. I said, well, that's pretty cool. So I decided to take a drive one day to Princeton, New Jersey, to visit the gravesite of President Grover Cleveland. And later that evening, I was speaking to a friend on the phone. I said, I wonder how many people have seen the gravesites of every president that's ever obviously lived and died and buried somewhere. And he said, oh, I'm sure somebody's done it. I said, well, I'm going to look into it. Well, I did research it, and there wasn't too many articles I found online. But I did find that that Princeton cemetery I was at, seeing Grover Cleveland, Vice President Aaron Burr is buried like 75 yards from Grover Cleveland in the same cemetery. And then there's a Constitution signer, John Witherspoon, also buried there. So I was like, well, great. Now I have to go back to Princeton Cemetery because I got to go see those two. And this sparked a very unusual hobby. So I now hold the world record officially, because the Guinness Book actually officially declared it back in 2022, for seeing every president, vice president, declaration signer, and U.S. Constitution signer's gravesites in the shortest amount of time. In 2020, I actually traveled literally to 33 states, over 55,000 miles in rental cars by myself. And I visited all of these places. Now, I didn't just visit presidents and vice presidents and declaration signers. I actually do a speaking presentation on Baseball Hall of Famers. I've actually seen over 150 Baseball Hall of Famers gravesites. I'm speaking in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame later this year, doing a presentation on that. So I've seen a lot of different things. It's not just presidents. But throughout the country, the presidents and people like that, vice presidents, are kind of scattered. You have Grover Cleveland in New Jersey that I just mentioned. You have down in Virginia, there's a lot in Virginia. Washington, of course, is one of them, probably the most infamous, of course. Then up in New York State, you have people like Teddy Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's also in the state of New York. You go to Ohio, you have James Garfield. He's buried there in Ohio. Several presidents buried in Ohio as well. And then you have, of course, in Springfield, Illinois, probably our most famous president of all time, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's tomb is there. But then you have places like Kansas, Abilene, Kansas, where good old Ike, Dwight Eisenhower, was raised there and he's buried there. So if you're going to do this journey, you got to go to Kansas. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Then you have all the way down in Texas, you have George W. Bush. He's actually buried on the grounds of Texas A&M University. Also, Lyndon Johnson's buried, of course, in Texas, from Texas. Many of you well know. Then you have people like Vice President Hubert Humphrey. He's buried all the way up there in Minnesota. So as you can see, this starts to really spread out if you're going to do this and try to take this journey. I did all of this within a matter of 9 months. So keep in mind, too, there's 2 presidents buried in California, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. So this isn't just an East Coast or Midwest thing. You got to venture out there to the West Coast as well. We have people like all the way up in Maine. That is Vice President Hannibal Hamlin. Hannibal Hamlin was Abraham Lincoln's vice president during his first term. Crazy enough, Hannibal Hamlin was about 2 months from becoming president of the United States, because Lincoln was reelected, and within about 2 months after reelection, he was assassinated. So we could have had a president, Hannibal Hamlin, in our history. So there's Hannibal Hamlin. All the way down in Delaware, you have Caesar Rodney. He's a declaration signer. And even further down in Georgia, you have Button Gwinnett. He's another declaration signer. So again, keep in mind, declaration signers, constitution signers, and even a lot of our presidents, a lot of them are in the eastern part of the United States. Of course, declaration signers, it goes without saying, 13 colonies, we know where they were. They were along the eastern part of the United States. So that's where a lot of these people are buried. So this kind of gives you an idea. These are actual mapped out trips that I took back in 2020. Just to give you, you can see the large loop all the way out into Ohio, up into Michigan. I would leave New Jersey at 9 o'clock at night, drive all night long, get to my first cemetery at sunrise about 7 a.m., and I would drive the rest of the day seeing different sites wherever I was going, and stop at about 8 o'clock at night. That's 20 to 21 hours of driving by myself. That is the undertaking, no pun intended, that it took for me to do this. It was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of driving. So if you are one of those people that's like, I hate being in the car for a long time, then don't do this, because it's not for you, I can assure you. So that's just an example, obviously, like I said, of some of these places and different trips that I took. So to start off the presidents, I always like to start off with the first 5 presidents. They are known as our founding father presidents because they truly are just that. All of these men, they were very integral parts in starting our country. Obviously, Washington goes without saying, he was our first president. But of course, then you have Adams and Jefferson. They literally were right there in Independence Hall, writing the Declaration of Independence, working on it. James Madison, they call him the father of the US Constitution. So these guys were very integral parts in the very early start and foundation of our country. So that's why they're known, of course, as the founding father presidents. And we'll just start off from the beginning, of course. George Washington, many of you I'm sure know, he is buried there in Mount Vernon at his plantation home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. Any of you who have not been there, this is right outside of Arlington, Virginia. So if you've been to Arlington National Cemetery, then you are right across the Potomac River from where George Washington resided and where he is buried. So you see me, you're going to see a lot of these pictures of this little kid. It's not some random little kids that I found at these places and took photos of. This is actually my son, Henry, who's now 10 years old. Henry and I just went back out to the Midwest 2 weeks ago. There's 39 presidents that are buried that you can go visit as of right now, because Jimmy Carter is somehow still ticking along. He's almost 100 years old. So 39 as of now. My son now has seen 37 out of 39 presidential gravesites. So not only has he almost seen them all, he needs the 2 in California still. I've now seen all of these 2 to 3 times myself. This is Washington. That's his home there in Mount Vernon. If you have never been and you can go, go. It's fabulous. It's beautiful. You can take a tour of the house. You can actually see the bedroom and the bed where George Washington died back so many years ago. And then you see his tomb. Now you'll see down in the bottom photos, you see my mug there in the bottom right. The picture right to the left of that, you kind of see this old doorway and brick building. That was Washington's original tomb. It's still on the ground. It's about 50 yards away from where the current tomb sits. But that was the original family tomb. And before Washington died, he made it a point that his relatives and ancestors would build him a new tomb, because they knew that this tomb was really kind of on the side of a hill. And they knew that at some point it was probably just going to go right into the Potomac. So he didn't think that would be such a great idea. So he didn't see the construction of his tomb where he's at when he was alive. So he was originally buried there in that tomb that you see in the bottom picture there. Of course, our country, we really wanted Washington to be buried at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. But his relatives, Martha Washington, she said, no, he wants to be here in Mount Vernon, so we're going to keep him here. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you see some of these photos, the ones with my son have been over the last couple of years. The one by myself, this was in 2020. I literally went the day in June that they reopened Mount Vernon, because it was closed for a few months from the pandemic. I walked up to the ticket booth, and the woman told me, I've worked here for 17 years. This is the first time in 17 years that a guest has the entire property all to themselves. And this happened to me a lot in 2020 during the pandemic. So I don't want anyone to ever get the misconception that you're going to go to Washington's tomb and there's not going to be anyone else. Because most times, Washington, Lincoln, and the other most famous one, probably can guess, Kennedy in Arlington, there's a lot of tourists there, especially in the summer months. There are other people there paying their respects to these men. So this was a very unique situation I got to. You see where It is gated off where the sarcophagus is. George is right here, just so everyone is aware, and Martha is over here to the left. Now, here's the thing. That gate is closed and locked. No one's allowed in there. I was the only one there in 2020. The worker standing there said, "Would you like me to unlock the gate?" This happened to me many times in 2020, which you will hear throughout this presentation. I looked at her and said, "That is a very silly question." Yes. So she unlocked the gate, but she told me the only thing I couldn't do was take any photos while I was inside. But I actually did get to place my hand on top of Washington's sarcophagus. Washington is right in there. He's not 6 feet under there. His coffin is right in that sarcophagus. So pretty interesting stuff. George Washington there in Mount Vernon. You're going to see here, this is my son. A little video here of us at Mount Vernon. There's my son. Of course, he wants to play with the rope, the metal rope, rather than look at anything. There's George right there, our first president of the United States. And then to the left is Martha, his wife. There's a lot of other family members there. Bushrod, I believe that's his first name, Bushrod Washington, who was a Supreme Court justice. He's also buried there. A lot of family members of the Washingtons are buried inside of this tomb. George Washington, Mount Vernon. Leads us now to Mr. Adams, John Adams. Of course, our second president of the United States, a man that many people said was very ornery. A lot of people didn't get along with John Adams. He was a short, stout man, but a brilliant man. And of course, his son, John Quincy Adams, became our sixth president of the United States. Now, you see, he's buried in Quincy, Massachusetts, at the United First Parish Church. It is not pronounced Quincy. It is pronounced Quincy, like a Z-E-E. So it's actually, so if anybody ever says John Quincy Adams, it's John Quincy Adams. He's buried there with his son and both of their wives. So here's a very cool thing. You see the church there. You see this wonderful tomb. Both the Adams are buried in the basement of this church. John Quincy Adams was a parishioner of this church. John Adams, this church, there was a church on these grounds, but not this church when he was alive. Right across the street, they've done a wonderful job here. Quincy, for anybody that doesn't know as well, is maybe 15 minutes outside of Boston, very close to Boston. They've done a wonderful job. They've made this little Adams National Historical Park. Right across the street is the Hancock Cemetery. Yes, because John Hancock was also from Quincy, Massachusetts. And that's where John Adams was originally buried. He was reinterred with John Quincy, his son. His son had requested that his parents be moved there because he knew him and his wife were going to be there. This church, you see my son and I there, but you see my picture with my mask on. That was in 2020. The church was closed. They weren't even holding mass on Sundays. It was all virtual. Everything was virtual. Well, I said, that can't be. So I contacted the church and I said, look, I'm this sole nut job that just wants to visit all the presidents. Is that possible? And the guy said, come to the back door when you get here and knock. I'll let you in. So I got to go into the basement, into the tomb by myself with him. So when you go into the basement, you go into the tomb, you'll see Abigail and John behind me, and right next to them in that room, you see the opening there in the top right. John Quincy and his wife are also right there. So their sarcophagus are right there. Very cool in this basement of this old church. And there actually is a pew that you can go sit in that John Quincy and his family used to sit in, and they have it marked off. So very, very, very cool. Moving on to my favorite president of all time, Thomas Jefferson. Reason being, his initials are TJ. They actually, some people used to call him TJ. And we have the same birthday, April 13th. We were both born on that day. So everybody always says, oh, are you related to this person? I always just tell them, no, I'm actually Jefferson reincarnated. So Jefferson, born in a Virginia colony. Keep in mind, all of these gentlemen, they were born in colonies that were still under British rule. It wasn't actually America then. The first president that was actually born in America, does anyone know? Little quiz. Martin Van Buren, our 8th president of the United States. He was the first that was actually born as an American in an American state. So, of course, Jefferson died at Monticello. Monticello is unbelievable. Monticello, it's the Italian translation of Little Mountain. Little Mountain because he was born right down the hillside from this mountain. When he was a boy, he used to tell his parents, I'm going to live on a house on the top of that mountain. Sure enough, he did. Now, Jefferson, a fabulous president, Louisiana Purchase, many, many things for our country. Probably not the best of people, but he was a fabulous president nonetheless. And here is the wonderful Monticello. Monticello, that's the home there that Jefferson lived in, died in. You can go take a tour of it, see the room he died in. It's absolutely fabulous. This is a family cemetery where Jefferson is. That tall obelisk, that is Thomas Jefferson buried underneath there. Now, that is not his original tombstone. His original tombstone is actually on display at the University of Missouri. Yes, don't ask me why, but it is. It's there, but nothing has changed. He was never reinterred or anything like that. He's always been here at Monticello. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. Great tour, fabulous. Over the years, they've even added in extra tours to speak about the enslaved people that once lived there. It's very informative, educated, and it's wonderful. They do a wonderful job now. But there's Jefferson, our 3rd president of the United States in Virginia. That is the state, by the way, that holds the most presidents. There is seven in the state of Virginia that are buried. 6 in Ohio and 5 in the state of New York. Moving on, another Virginia man. That would be James Madison, father of the Constitution, our shortest president of the United States. This man was a very, very tiny man, but a brilliant man of very few words. He is buried at his plantation home in Virginia of Montpelier. Montpelier, even though I'm biased towards Jefferson, is probably the most beautiful plantation estate that I've ever seen. It's absolutely stunning and amazing. Now, a very funny story about, there is some humor to this, because remember, I'm just some regular old Joe that went and did all this. And during the pandemic, we were all very conscious of keeping clean and sanitized, right? So I had a little bottle of spray sanitizer in my car. And when I pulled up, by the way, had the grounds of Montpelier all to myself. I pulled up to the grounds and I sprayed my hands with sanitizer and rubbed my hands. I got out of the car. This is like July, keep in mind. Very hot, very warm outside. That's actually me by myself down there at Madison's grave. And I start walking because there's a sign that says Enslaved Cemetery. So not far from the family cemetery, there's a little cemetery where enslaved people that Madison had owned are buried. So I wanted to go over and see that and pay my respects. And all of a sudden I realized there's bees all around me. And there's like 2 or 3, then there's like 4 or 5, then there's literally like 30 or 40, and they're chasing me now. And I'm running through the grounds of Montpelier, swatting bees away, hoping I'm not going to get stung. Well, I didn't get stung, but I pay my respects. I take a look. I get back in my car and I'm like, why in the heck were all these bees after me? Well, that spray sanitizer was lavender scented. The bees thought I was a giant flower floating around. So that was not one of my most brilliant moments of my life, but nonetheless, a pretty funny story that I got chased by bees on James Madison's property. Now, the only negative about doing all this in 2020, the positive was I had all of these places to myself, right? I got some special treatment that a lot of people don't tend to get. But the tours of these homes, it was closed. So you could go see the home, but you couldn't take the tour because it was all closed due to COVID. My son and I have since been back. You see us there in the top right, and we have taken the tour of Montpelier and the estate, which again is fabulous. You can see in the top picture here, the obelisk right behind James. That is Dolly Madison, his wife. Any of you guys that remember the ice cream, Dolly Madison ice cream? That's not a coincidence. James Madison's favorite food was ice cream. That's why people 200 years later had the brilliant idea to come up with a brand of ice cream named Dolly Madison. So she was kind of really the pioneer of First Ladies, Dolly Madison. Very involved in hosting at the White House, hosting parties for dignitaries. So she was kind of really the first lady that really took charge of that kind of thing. Last but not least, good old James Monroe, president during the era of good feelings. Nothing happened really of any sort of significance during this man's tenure in the White House. It was just a lot of prosperity in the country. So everybody thought James Monroe was wonderful for the most part. He was born in Virginia. He died in New York City, and he was buried in New York City for 27 years. He was buried, I will show you here in a second, at something called the New York City Marble Cemetery. If you go there, it's kind of downtown, heading toward where the Trade Center and such was. You will see the Marble Cemetery is about the size of this room. It's always locked. It's only opened about 2 days a year. It's very old, and James Monroe is buried there. Reason being, he died in New York at his daughter's home. He went to visit her, was not expecting to die, but did. And then the family just said, we're going to just bury him here in New York. And he stayed there until almost 3 decades later. His family had him reinterred and moved to the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, where he is laid to rest to this day. Richmond, Virginia, Hollywood Cemetery, where is also where John Tyler, our 10th president, is buried. They're literally buried within 15 feet of one another. I'll show you that. And also another president, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, is also buried at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. So there's James Monroe. They call this the bird cage, his grave. You can see it's this big, almost Gothic-looking cathedral type, marker. It's beautiful, it really is. If you see up here, you see this photo here? You see the tall obelisk that looks like it has like statues and a marble bust on it? That's John Tyler's grave. Right behind him through the trees, you can see James Monroe's grave, the birdcage. That's how close they're buried to one another. They actually call this the President's Circle. So John Tyler and James Monroe are buried literally 20 feet from one another. It's really cool, beautiful. The bottom two right pictures, that's the Marble Cemetery in New York, where James Monroe was laid to rest for many, many years. You see that grave there that I have in the bottom right? Right behind that is where the plot was that Monroe once was laid to rest in New York City. Now, just a quick fun fact, because he's up on the screen. John Tyler is the only president in the history of our country to be buried, and over his casket was not the American flag, it was the flag of the Confederacy. He is the only president that ever did not have an American flag draped on his casket during a funeral procession. Well, he was in favor of the Confederacy. He definitely was somebody that favored the South quite a bit. And another big reason why, sir, is because the man who was in charge of organizing his funeral, his good friend Jefferson Davis, who's also buried at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. I'll go back because I don't know off the top of my head. It was right before the Civil War. He was 10th, so he's probably 1840 something, somewhere in that range. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so that's an interesting fact. And Jefferson Davis, little side note too, he was also reinterred. He wasn't originally there in Richmond. He was buried down in New Orleans because that's where he went on the run. When we won the Civil War, we were looking for Jefferson Davis, and he went down to New Orleans. He died there, and he was originally buried there in New Orleans, but then he was reinterred. Why Richmond? It was the capital of the Confederacy back in the Civil War. So now I'm going to kind of speak a little bit about contrast and memorials. And what I mean by this is how they've changed so much over the years. You'll notice those first 5 founding fathers, and even some after that, a lot of them are buried on their home grounds, their plantation or estate home grounds. They have family cemeteries there. They're buried there. And then you get to kind of the middle presidents, and things changed a whole lot. So we're going to take a look here. These are all presidential grave sites. You have President George W. Bush, top left. Next to him, President Calvin Coolidge. Next to him, James Garfield. Next to him, President Grant. Next to him, President Warren Harding. Down bottom right, William Henry Harrison. Right next to him, that is good old Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, out there on Long Island. Next to him, all those steps, that's President William McKinley. Next to him, yes, that is Lincoln's tomb, right there in the bottom. And then here to the left over here, one of my favorites, we will get to it, President Herbert Hoover. Not my favorite president, favorite grave, so let's make that clear too. So the early years, like I said, you go to Washington, he's buried in Mount Vernon at his grounds, at his estate grounds. You look at somebody like James Madison, he's there at Montpelier on his grounds of his home. Very big theme for a long time with our early presidents. You look at Andrew Jackson, there's Andrew Jackson's grave. That's the Hermitage in Tennessee, right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Old Hickory's buried there. Another fabulous, fabulous tour you can take of Andrew Jackson's plantation home. They actually literally have a pair of slippers that Jackson wore is still there on display, which is fabulous to see, of course. That's his grave right there, Andrew Jackson. But again, right behind, there's the home. It's right behind the home. So it's right there on his grounds. Very, very interesting story. He had a parrot, a pet parrot, Andrew Jackson. Why is that important? Because they held his funeral at his home in Hermitage. And as the priest was giving the sermon out on the porch with all of the guests in chairs sitting there, the parrot kept cursing because Andrew Jackson used to curse a lot and the parrot learned the curse words. So imagine that, the priest is saying, we lay to rest, and the parrots, all these, they actually had to take the parrot and put him inside. That's a true story. There's William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison in Ohio. If you're at his grave, this huge, tall obelisk monument. If you look out across his grave, you see a river. On the other side of the river, that is actually Kentucky. So he's right there on the Ohio River on the banks. Inside of that is, you'll see in the top left there, that is William Henry Harrison and his wife are inside the wall there in that tomb. That was closed during COVID. A very nice lady, local historical society there. She met me there. She unlocked it and let me in to go inside and see the tomb. And then we get to Martin Van Buren. He's up in Kinderhook, New York. That's it. And Kinderhook, New York, if you go down this little road, picture like in Colts Neck, you just go down like a country little road, and off to the left, there'll be just a cemetery there on the side of the road. That's what that's like. There's no grand big thing. It's just this little roadside cemetery, and our 8th president of the United States is in there. So pretty interesting stuff. That's in Kinderhook. You had John Tyler. I just spoke of him there in Hollywood Cemetery. You can see the first 5 presidents buried on their estates. Well, even first 7, because Jackson was 7. Now 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It gets to be kind of these bigger, taller obelisks, almost a little bit more of a grand visually, aesthetically pleasing. Zachary Taylor down there in Louisville, Kentucky. It gets to be kind of like bigger. But then we get to Millard Fillmore. Anybody know what number? 13. He's 13. He's up in Buffalo, New York. So see what I was telling you guys? You want to do this? You got to go all the way up to Buffalo. No offense to anybody that's from Buffalo, but it's not a fun place. You know, Niagara Falls is there, the Bills are there, but that's about it. There you go, Franklin Pierce. He's in Concord, New Hampshire. Franklin Pierce was another kind of sympathizer with the South. He was the 14th president, so right around Civil War time. His grave for over 100 years would not mention that he was president of the United States because the state of New Hampshire would not recognize it. Little fun fact. And then you have James Buchanan. He's out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A lot of people think, I'm sure there's a lot of presidents buried in Pennsylvania. He's the only one. There's nobody buried in Philadelphia, except for Benjamin Franklin, and he wasn't a president. So, but there's James Buchanan, you know, nice, but very, very plain, very plain. You will actually notice, I will point out, you see the rainbow flag by his gravesite? There is a book out. There's a lot of historians who have done research. They do believe that President Buchanan was possibly a homosexual, was gay. So that's why you will see rainbow flags and that sort of thing indicating that at his grave sometimes. He was the only bachelor president, just so you know, James Buchanan. Lincoln to Harding. Then we get into these monstrosities of memorials. You go to Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. We're going to get to more of him, but it's huge. And you sit and wonder, Abraham Lincoln would have never, ever wanted a memorial like that. He was one of the most humble men ever. He would have never wanted this grand thing, but it is grand. And then you have President Grant. They are in New York, right in Manhattan, right along the river. Beautiful. Now, Grant did want this. Grant knew they were actually building this. He died not far from here, up in upstate New York. He was writing his memoirs, which, if any of you like old historical books, President Grant's memoirs are one of the greatest things you will ever read, and I mean that sincerely. Reason he wrote those when he was dying, he was bankrupt. The man was so broke and poor, he wrote his memoir so he would have money to leave his family. James Garfield in Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, my favorite presidential grave. We will get to that in a minute. It is spectacular. Spectacular. William McKinley, all the way up these steps. Every morning, if you go there in Canton, Ohio, Canton, anybody else familiar? Canton, the Hall of Fame for football is about 5 minutes around the corner from this. Every morning, if you go here, you will see people running up and down the stairs for exercise. Right through those doors, when you walk in, the giant sarcophagus caskets of Mr. and Mrs. McKinley. It's absolutely beautiful, it really is. Ever notice that our 4 slain assassinated presidents, McKinley, Garfield, Lincoln, and Kennedy, have some of the most absolutely amazing memorials for themselves? Warren Harding, that's also in Ohio, Marion, Ohio. Beautiful. Look at the size of that. It looks like a coliseum. Want to hear something crazy? Warren Harding's considered to be one of the worst presidents in our history. His cabinet may have been the most corrupt. Yes, that includes present day, guys. I hate to tell you, go read about it. Corrupt cabinet. Kids from all over the United States donated and sent in their pennies to help build this memorial. So imagine if you told a 6-year-old kid today, you have to donate money to build the president a memorial for their grave, it would never happen. That goes to show you how the respect for the office of presidency has changed over the years in our country. This is a man that was not revered as president, but yet kids still sent in their pennies to help build him a memorial. And then you start to hit from Franklin Roosevelt on to present day. Presidents are buried at their memorial libraries. Their presidential library and museum, most of them are buried at. Roosevelt, he's buried at his family home in Hyde Park. Right there, there's Franklin. That's Hyde Park, where he was born and raised. But his presidential library is right there on the grounds. Now, the very cool thing about Roosevelt is right behind his grave. See that like sundial sticking up? Right in front of that is a circular little grave. And that is the grave of Fallon, his beloved dog, who went everywhere with him. And if you see photos of Franklin Roosevelt's funeral, Fallon is standing right next to his grave. Literally, never left his side. And Fallon's buried very close to him. Very funny story. When I went there back in 2020, this little garden area where Franklin is, there was a gate that was locked. So I literally army crawled underneath the gate so I could go see the grave. And I tore my sweatshirt. I tore a hole in my sweatshirt on the bottom of the fence. And I kept the sweatshirt like I'm some sort of war veteran and be like, see, this is from when I went to go visit Franklin's grave. But go to Hyde Park. It's beautiful if you've never been there. It's absolutely spectacular. Ike is buried out in Kansas right on the grounds of his library and museum. He's buried inside of that church. It's a little church that him and his wife are both in Abilene, Kansas. There's nothing in Abilene, Kansas, I promise you. It's kind of central western Kansas, and it's a small little town, and if you go there, everything is Ike. Ike's Garage, Ike's Deli, Ike's Ice Cream. They like Ike, so they truly do like Ike. And then you look, Gerald Ford in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Now, he's buried on the grounds. You see the wall there? He's actually buried underneath that wall right there, him and Betty Ford. That's the grounds of the museum. Now, his library is actually on the grounds of Michigan State University. He's one of the only presidents where the museum and library are in two different locations, but he's buried there at the museum in Grand Rapids. Bush, President Bush, he's buried, that's on the grounds of Texas A&M University. So his library and museum is right there. You take this beautiful pathway through the woods, and there's President Bush's gravesite back there in the woods. So you can see that's what all these presidents are going to do. President Obama, he has his library already being built in Chicago. He's going to go there. President Bush Jr., he originally wanted to be buried at his ranch in Texas. After going to his father's funeral, he told Laura, I want to change it and I want to be buried at our library. His library and museum is in Dallas, Texas. His father's closer toward Houston, Texas. But Bush Jr. is going to be buried in Dallas. I had the privilege, doing this for a few years, I've actually seen the blueprint of what Laura and George Bush's graves are going to look like. Laura Bush has recreated the Rose Garden from the White House. So it's going to be quite beautiful and spectacular. The only one that's not going to go, that's more present day, Ronald Reagan out in California, he's also at his library. Nixon, he's at his family home where he was born. Closest proximity, by the way, from where you are, sir, back there in the back left, that's where Nixon was born, and where I'm standing is where he's buried. He's in the closest proximity from where he was born to where he's buried, Richard Nixon. But his library museum is on the grounds. The only one that's not is President Jimmy Carter. Of course, his wife just died, and back down there in Plains, Georgia, where they've lived for so long, she's buried in the front yard, and so will Jimmy be, buried in the front yard of their home. So I want to show you just a few of my favorites. It's hard not to tell you Lincoln's one of my favorite presidents, and of course, gravesites I've ever been to. Now, you see my son and I there. I took him back. He's my son's favorite president. He's very, very into Abraham Lincoln. When I went there, I was the last one. I got there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were closing at 4:30. And the guy said, go ahead, you can go in. I had the tomb to myself. Now, the eerie thing about the tomb is you'll notice the floors in there, it's all marble, all hard, hard marble floor. And you walk in and there's this mini replica of the Lincoln Memorial statue in this kind of like foyer area. And then you go to your right and there's a couple little statues of Lincoln from early life. You then have to walk down this long marble corridor to get to where Lincoln is. And I was alone, no one there, and I could hear my shoes clicking against the marble floor. It was just such a very surreal moment in doing this and seeing it. And there's Lincoln, of course, etched into the top there. Now he belongs to the ages, so famously said when he passed. Lincoln is 10 feet underneath this. Lincoln's body has been stolen twice. When it was stolen, his son Robert decided we need better security here. So they actually put a huge concrete vault 10 feet underneath and put Lincoln's casket inside that vault. You see the tomb on the outside. There's a very small doorway on the side of that tomb. Any of you that have ever been inside of a crawl space underneath a house, it's similar to that. A crawl space that leads to where that concrete vault is, where Lincoln's casket now sits. I got out of the tomb in 2020, and the man looked at me and said, would you like to go in that crawl space? And I looked at him and said, does a bear take a crap in the woods? So I went in, and I got to see within 10 feet of where Lincoln actually is. It's a very, 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 very cool place. It's a very cool place. Little video here of my son's visit to Lincoln's tomb. It's a little sideways, actually. I apologize. I don't know why it's sideways right now, but there's Lincoln's tomb and there's my son waving. But very, very cool place. Garfield, I mentioned earlier, my favorite presidential tomb. When I went in 2020, it was closed. So I had to go back. Garfield's tomb is huge. It actually has gargoyles on the outside of it, etched. It's fabulous. President Garfield was assassinated not long into his presidency. He was assassinated at a train station in Washington, D.C. Why did he die in New Jersey? He died many months later in New Jersey. Reason being, he had a summer cottage not far from President Grant's cottage down here in Long Branch. He requested, because he still was conscious, I want to go to die by the ocean. So they actually created a railway to bring him down to Elberon, Long Branch. The home no longer stands. There is a placard where the home once stood. It's right next to the ocean on Ocean Avenue. He died not because of the gunshot wound. He died of sepsis because when he was shot, the doctor at the train station tried to take the bullet out. There was no sanitizing back then. It infected his blood, and President Garfield died one of the slowest, most painful deaths you could ever imagine. If he would have been shot even 100 years later, he would have never died. So President Garfield from Ohio was moved back to Ohio. There's a church in Long Branch called Church of the Presidents. There's a little tea shack in the back of that church. That tea shack is made from the railroad ties that they made to bring his body down to Long Branch. That is the only thing that still stands from that day. By the way, they call it Seven Presidents Beach. 7 presidents did not visit Long Branch. It has long been debunked. They think that 4, maybe 5 did, not 7. So just keep that in mind. But Long Branch was a resort area back then. There's President Garfield's tomb. When you go in President Garfield's tomb, you see this giant statue and this huge chandelier. You go down to the basement and you see these and you think that's kind of neat. That's his actual casket. He's the only president that his casket and his wife are on display. There's no sarcophagus. There's nothing underneath the ground. That right there with that American flag draped over it is President Garfield's body inside that casket. So it is a remarkable, look at the size of it there in the top left. It's in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio. There's a lot of people buried there. Rockefeller's buried there. Any of you that love baseball, the only man to ever be killed in a major league game, Ray Chapman, who was hit in the head and died. He's buried there at Lakeview Cemetery. It's wonderful. Garfield's tomb is something that even if you don't like presidential history, you're ever in Cleveland, go see it. Just the architecture alone is just spectacular. And here is my little visit. Again, it's going sideways. You kind of like everybody to be sideways, apparently. Well, anyway, this is, you can see it's a little video I put in. Maybe on Zoom they're seeing it normal, but there's President Garfield if you want to break your neck and take a look. So one of my other favorite, so my father passed away in 2021. In 2020, when I was doing all this traveling, my father was kind of ill. He wasn't able to travel. So he was kind of living vicariously through me, seeing all my photos of this stuff. My father, who was a very, very big Kennedy buff, loved Kennedy, he was an Irish Catholic man, my father, so he was big into Kennedy. He remarked to me that he thought Herbert Hoover's grave was the prettiest that I had been to. And I actually concur. He's buried in Iowa at his childhood home where he was born and his library. He died in New York, buried out in Iowa. He actually was the first president born west of the Mississippi River. So another little fun fact. Not a very good president, but a very self-made man. And a man who, if you read about him and know about him, after his presidency, was one of the greatest humanitarians that our world has ever seen. He did things for other countries in Europe during World War II, for our country. He was actually a very good man, just not a very good president. But this is his grave in West Branch, Iowa. It sits atop this beautiful hill. It's spectacular. And if you're standing on the hill and looking down, you see a tiny little building. That's actually the house that Hoover was born in. So very, very cool. Born right there, buried right there. It may not look a lot in pictures, but it's spectacular. And they have two giant spotlights. So at night, the only thing that shines is the flag and the graves. It's beautiful. It's absolutely stunning, beautiful. And I've been there 4 times now, and all 4 times since it's Iowa, I make the hour-long trip north and I go to the Field of Dreams. So anybody that likes baseball, you can go see the Field of Dreams as well. So there you go. So Herbert Hoover, those 3 are some of my favorites that I've seen as far as presidents go. I'd be remiss not to include this. I'm sure the video is going to be sideways, but this is a video that I took. Oh, no, it isn't. I want you guys to notice this video. This was in 2020. Arlington just opened. I was the first visitor of the day. The entire cemetery to myself. It's the morning. It's COVID. So they have the flag at half-mast behind this due to COVID. And you'll see the morning mist. You could hear a pin drop. This is unique because usually you hear nothing but people standing around this and paying their respects. This is a unique video. And it does go sideways. But you see the flag at half-mast. You see the morning. It was unreal. I was alone by myself, and it was absolutely spectacular. I got to be there to see Kennedy's grave. Any of you that have ever been there, maybe you've been there many years ago. Since then, of course, Ted Kennedy is buried not far from there. And of course, Bobby Kennedy, his brother, has been buried there since 1968 when he was assassinated as well. It is a true story. Anybody that's ever heard the story of Kennedy kind of picked his gravesite? Not necessarily, but kind of true. May of 1963, about 6 months before his assassination, Kennedy was at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, like all of our presidents are, on Memorial Day, laying a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown. When they were leaving, him and Jackie, the Tomb of the Unknown's at the top of the hill. You have to kind of walk down the hill. He stopped, the story goes. And from Kennedy's grave, you could see the Washington Monument, you could see the Lincoln Memorial. And he remarked to Jackie, man, this would be some place to be buried. Little did he know 6 months later he would be. Jackie remembered that because when Kennedy was assassinated, Kennedy's sisters were adamant about Kennedy going back to Massachusetts to be buried. Of course, the decision was fully Jackie's alone, being his wife. And she said, no, I want him to go to Arlington, and I know exactly the spot I want him to go to. So that's where he went. And of course, Bobby and Ted Kennedy were in full support of Jackie, kind of going against their sister's wishes. So that's the story of Kennedy picking his own gravesite. So I had to include Grover Cleveland. That's where this all began for me, right? The 22nd and 24th president, the only president to do 2 non-consecutive terms, although we shall see. Maybe that's going to happen in November with Donald Trump. That very well could happen this year. So he was buried in Caldwell, New Jersey. His birthplace is still there. They have tours there. It's a fabulous little place. They actually have a piece of his wedding cake on, yeah, I know. It's literally like a petrified piece of his wedding cake on display at his birthplace. He died in Princeton. He's buried in Princeton in probably one of the most unremarkable graves you'll ever see for a president. That's it. But there's no mention of him being president of the United States on this grave. It's just Grover Cleveland, and this, you'll see the bottom right, and there's all these flags there. I was invited to the wreath laying ceremony there 2 years ago for his birthday. So that was during his birthday, during the wreath laying ceremony. All presidents during their birthdays have a wreath laid at their graves. Right next to him is his daughter, Ruth, baby Ruth. That's actually how they got the idea to name the candy bar Baby Ruth. That's not true. That's what they tell you. But why is that not true? Because I think they did that and said that to not get sued. Because at the time in the 20s, Babe Ruth was popular. So I think that they named it actually after Babe Ruth, but they made the story up that it was after Baby Ruth Cleveland, so they wouldn't get sued. And I promise you, there's historians that believe that too. I believe that to be the case. He's in Princeton, so if you're standing at his grave, if you look to your left, maybe 50 yards is Aaron Burr. Anybody that knows the famous duel, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was vice president to Thomas Jefferson. Right next to Aaron Burr's grave is a president of Princeton University. Back then it was New Jersey University, John Witherspoon, who is a Declaration signer. And the story goes, a descendant of actress Reese Witherspoon. Oh. So this is just some graves I wanted to throw in at the end. That right there is in Missouri. That's Harry Truman's grave, right there in the top left. Underneath there in Ohio, that's Rutherford B. Hayes. That's his grave, one of my favorites. Beautiful, beautiful grave. The middle there, that's George W. Bush on the grounds of Texas A&M. My son and I were just there this past year. Notice how the gate is open. We got lucky because the gate was open. We went on the death date anniversary of George Bush's death. A security guard was standing there. It's just me and my son. We saw the gate was open. We said, could we go in and take a quick picture? She goes, quickly. I said, why is the gate open? There's never a security guard, never a gate, never the gate open. A special guest is coming. I'm convinced that it was George Jr. coming to visit his father's grave on his anniversary. I tried to convince my son to stick around. He's 10. He didn't want to stick around. Because I told him, I said, George Bush is the kind of guy, he's kind of a jovial, goofy kind of guy. If he sees a little boy with a baseball, I always asked my son wears baseball hats, and he did in that picture, he got away with it in that one. I always try to remind him to take his hat off at the gravesites to pay respects. I said, if he sees a little boy with a baseball hat on, he might stop and talk to you for a minute, but he didn't want to wait. Down in the bottom right, that's Lyndon Johnson's grave on his home ranch there in Johnson City, Texas. You're not supposed to go over that wall to Johnson's grave. We'll leave it at that. In the middle there, that's Franklin Pierce in New Hampshire. Millard Fillmore in the top right. And in the middle on the top, that's Warren Harding, that big, huge Coliseum that I showed you. That's Warren Harding's grave there in Ohio. So a lot of very interesting graves. It's a very big undertaking to do this, but it's a lot of fun. It really is. To see the different contrasts and memorials, to see, because a lot of these men picked where they wanted to be buried. So just to kind of get a viewpoint, people always ask me, what's so fascinating about this to you? I used to tell my mom and dad, it's because it makes these people human. We sometimes look at presidents, celebrities, athletes like they're larger than life, and some of them are. But they're human beings like you and I. And at the end of the day, guess what? They're going to the same place we are, in the ground or cremated. So to me, it kind of brought their story more real to me. It wasn't just a person I read about. It was a human being that had family and friends and loved ones. And you get to go pay your respects to these people just like you would your own loved ones. So that's why it always fascinated me. But yeah, I've seen a lot of graves, not just presidents, vice presidents, athletes, famous people. You pretty much name it, I've probably seen it. So,
Calvin Coolidge.
yeah, oh, up in Vermont, one of my favorite graves of all time. So Calvin Coolidge, he's buried in Vermont. He's buried literally a mile down the road from his birthplace. He's in the mountains of Vermont. He's one of my favorites. Again, a roadside cemetery where he's just there. It's just a grave. I'll actually go back to the beginning so I can just show you that grave. It's beautiful. And a mile down the road where he was born, the famous story about Calvin Coolidge, he didn't say too much. He was a quiet man. And when Warren Harding died in office, Coolidge was his vice president, became president. In the middle of the night, Coolidge woke up about 2 a.m. to be informed, you're now president. His father was there. This is at his birthplace in Vermont he was at. His father was there. His father happened to be a notary public. So the father was able to actually swear him in legally. So Calvin Coolidge very famously got sworn in the middle of the night by his father, and then he went back to bed. And the other great Coolidge story that I always love is there was a bet. A woman had a dinner at the White House one time, and she had a bet. And she said to President Coolidge, I have a bet that I can make you say more than 3 words tonight. And Calvin Coolidge famously smirked, leaned over to the lady and whispered, you lose. And that was it. They used to call him Silent Cal. But if you see his gravesite, that I'll show you here in a second, it's very plain. It fits the man. Like I told you about Lincoln, it doesn't fit him. When you read about Lincoln, that big memorial doesn't fit Lincoln. this gravesite of Coolidge fits him. Roosevelt's grave at his home in Hyde Park, it fits Roosevelt. You know, Roosevelt would still be president if we let him today. I mean, he did about 78 terms in a row, so he would still be president. So it fits him, that kind of like glamorous thing. It just fits. Some of them it fits, some of them it doesn't. Coolidge is one of those that it does fit. Am I going the right way or the wrong way? Do you know? I am going backwards, right? I am going the other way? Oh, geez. Is there any way you can get to the first slide for me? That would be easier. Any other questions, though, while we're waiting for that? And there's no silly questions. I've heard it all, trust me.
Roosevelt's wife and Lincoln's wife, are they buried here?
So, yeah, Mary Todd Lincoln, the sarcophagus where Lincoln is, right across from that, inside of the wall of the vault, is their children and Mary Todd. The only one that's not buried there is Robert Lincoln. He's buried, he's son of Abraham Lincoln. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Robert Lincoln, want to hear something crazy? Was in attendance for 3 out of 4 presidential assassinations. He was at Ford's Theater the night his father was assassinated. He was standing next to James Garfield in the train station when Garfield was assassinated. And he was right outside the Pan American Exposition building in Buffalo, New York, when McKinley was assassinated. Could you imagine being present for 3 out of 4 presidential assassinations? If I was somebody that knew him, I would say, please, whatever you do, don't come to the next event. Stay far away. So I'll get to Coolidge just to show you. And yes, yes. And Roosevelt's wife, of course, she's right next to him as well. Eleanor's right there. And Eleanor, you know, she very famously, you know, she had her bouts with Franklin over infidelity and everything else, but she stuck by his side the whole time, of course.
Do you ever visit public cemeteries, not in your special person interest, just to see their landscaping and their artistry? And if you do you have a favorite or two? It's a great question. So yes, to answer that question, yes. Now, I've stumbled across cemeteries that I was there for a specific reason, and then other things struck me. My favorite cemetery, and I actually just told my son this because we were just there a couple of weeks ago. I said, I think I want to be buried here. And he said, what are you talking about? Is actually the Lexington Cemetery in Lexington, Kentucky. It is probably one of the most beautiful cemeteries I've ever seen. The grounds are spectacular. Buried there is John Breckinridge, who was a vice president. He's actually the only vice president who actually became a traitor. He actually was an officer for the Confederacy. So in the Civil War, he took sides with the Confederacy. He's buried there. But who's also buried there is Henry Clay, who's a very prominent politician back then. He has a fabulous, huge obelisk memorial there. And anybody that knows Ernest and Slinky Dog, the voice of Slinky Dog and the guy who played Ernest in the movies, James Varney, he's also buried there at Lexington Cemetery. Oh, there it goes. Let me go back. So there's Coolidge right there. Up in the top, you see the snow, of course, being Vermont. That's it. And you see it just says Calvin Coolidge. He was born on the 4th of July, died. And then it's just the presidential seal etched into his grave. That's it. That's how simple it is. So, yes, but I've seen, you know, there's a lot of cemeteries I've gone to. Lexington Cemetery sticks out that I love. Follow up.
Sure.
Do you have any impressions of my favorite, Greenwood in Brooklyn?
Oh, Greenwood's terrific. Greenwood's filled with history. There's actually a couple of old Baseball Hall of Famers buried there. There's a Constitution signer buried there. Also, Frank Howard, anybody, maybe, well, not the baseball player. This Frank Howard was anybody know? the Wizard of Oz in the movie. He was the wizard. He's buried at Greenwood. Also, I believe it was Alice Paul. I believe that's her name. Alice Paul is buried at Greenwood. Alice Paul is the actress who was on stage that night in Ford's Theater. And she's the actress who so famously ran up to the booth and laid Lincoln's head in her lap. So she's buried at Greenwood Cemetery as well. Greenwood's fabulous, terrific. Love it, beautiful. Just make sure you get a cemetery map. It's quite big and you can get kind of lost in there, but it's a fabulous cemetery. Yeah, it's actually fun. Alice Paul, years later, after the Lincoln assassination, she tried to sell pieces of what she said was her dress with blood stains on it from Lincoln, but it was false because Lincoln didn't bleed. The little bullet went in his head, not far, right behind his ear. Tiny little blood came out. The blood all over the chair and clothing in that booth was from Major General Rathbone, who was in the booth, who tried to stop John Wilkes Booth, and Booth took out a knife and slashed Rathbone's cheek down to his neck. Rathbone almost bled to death. And he was bleeding so profusely that it was his blood that was all over everything, not Lincoln's. So that is kind of a false thing that people always, you might read about, like, oh, there was a piece of clothing that had Lincoln's blood. No, there wasn't. There really, truly wasn't. So yeah, that's Coolidge is up there. Any other questions?
I know you went to Truman's, but what was your opinion about Harry S?
Yeah, I love Truman's grave.
You did that on Facebook.
I love Truman's grave. It was fabulous, tremendous. His museum, his presidential museum, is the best one I've ever been to. It's fabulous. There's a desk in an office at the museum that up until the day he died, he used to go to and work from every single day. Harry Truman. Harry Truman, who had no idea about the atomic bomb, because Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, I think they had, the one negative thing you could probably say about them was, I think they had this thing of like immortality, like they were going to just go on forever, because they didn't share much of anything with their vice presidents. And Truman had no idea about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb until after Roosevelt died in office. And then, of course, Truman famously, he went to Hyde Park. He saw Eleanor and he said, "I am so sorry, Mrs. Roosevelt. My thoughts and prayers are with you." And she looked at him and said, "No, Harry, my thoughts are with you now." So,
Interesting thing about Harry Truman. When I was a little boy, they used to have Dave Garroway in the Today Show, and Harry Truman would visit New York, and he would have a walking stick.
Yeah.
And he would walk so fast that the photographers couldn't catch up to him.
yeah,
He also did everything for his daughter, who was a piano player,
yeah.
to get on the stage.
Yeah. I just bought myself at the library just 2 weeks ago. Truman had a very famous placard on his desk in the White House. "The buck stops here." And I have a replica of that now sitting on my desk at my house, which is wonderful. What was the question in the back? I apologize.
Gravesite, and can you really find it? I know what cemetery it is.
Oh, Ruth's very easy to find. Yeah. It sits up on a hill. But the reason you can't miss Ruth, it's a kind of a tall obelisk. But Ruth's is one of the only ones you will ever see. There will be 900 baseballs all over his grave. There will be bats. George Herman is still very visited to this day. And Yogi's grave, Yogi's right in New Jersey. Yogi's is very plain. The thing I love about Yogi's, because I'm such a Yogi fan, I just love, Lawrence Peterborough. I absolutely love it. I just was at Yogi's birthplace and childhood home in St. Louis, Missouri. That's the other thing. It is. It's an Airbnb.
Yeah.
It's an Airbnb. You could stay in Yogi's birthplace in St. Louis, which is very cool. Right across the street from Yogi's birthplace is Joe Garagiola, childhood friend of Yogi's. So, but yeah, Ruth's is great. And in that cemetery, I don't know if you're a football fan, but right around the corner from where Ruth's buried is the gravesite of Wellington Mara, the longtime owner of the New York Giants. He's buried there as well. And right behind Ruth Yankee fans, is Billy Martin's grave. Yeah.
We have Vince Lombardi here.
We do, right in Middletown. You know what's terrific about that? Thank you for bringing that up. So I'm a sports fan. My father and uncles and aunts, they ingrained sports into me from the time I was a little boy. This is kind of a homecoming for me here today in Middletown. My grandparents lived over on Wilson Avenue, and every Sunday, I grew up in Eatontown, so I would be here in Middletown every Sunday from the time I was this big until I was this big. So I'm very familiar with Middletown. So this is a little bit of a homecoming for me. And I talked to so many sports fans over the years, people who claim to be Packers fans that live here in New Jersey. And I always say to them, you know, Lombardi's buried right in Middletown. They go, he is? Yeah, he is. Very cool, though. Who's right around the corner in the same cemetery from Lombardi? George Snuffy Sternweiss, the New York Yankee who won the batting title. Why did he win the batting title? Because DiMaggio and them were off fighting the war. So he wasn't fighting the war. And Snuffy Sternweiss famously was killed in a tragic train accident in Newark. The train derailed and fell into the Newark Bay. George Snuffy Sternweiss. So, you know, you'll get some people that'll try to trick you. Name all the Yankees who have won the batting title. No one ever named Snuffy Sternweiss.
306 average is nothing to
There you go. But Snuffy Sternweiss is buried right 50 yards from where Lombardi is. Sure.
Have you ever been to the St. Patrick's Cathedral catacombs?
Yeah, so the St. Patrick's Cathedral catacombs in New York City. I have not. I've been to St. Patrick's many, many times. My son and I were just there in December. We visited the tree. Then we went into the, of course, St. Pat's. No, but I have been in the catacombs of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Because buried in the catacombs of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., first of all, there's only one president buried in Washington, D.C. Does anybody know? Woodrow Wilson. He's buried inside the National Cathedral. But in the catacombs underneath, Helen Keller is buried there. So, very, very cool. But no, St. Patrick's in New York, I've never been inside the catacombs. There was a question there and then a question there. Go ahead, sir. Back there.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. This
You-
is so informative.
Thank you. Very.
It makes me want to do this. You mentioned that who's the president that is the only president that's their conference on display?
That's James Garfield. That's in Cleveland, Ohio. Yep.
Since his conference on display, are there guards?
So it's inside of it's almost like inside of a cage. It's like a gated area. So you can go right down to it and you can even kind of stick. You can't go up to the coffin. Now, I know someone who has been able to go up to the coffin. It wasn't me. It was a friend of mine. But you got to kind of schmooze the people that work there. They may be on lock-in. Cleveland, Ohio. James Garfield, Cleveland, Ohio, at Lakeview Cemetery.
And every year you say on all of deceased president's birthday, the Washington lays a wreath.
Well, there's a wreath-laying cemetery, usually by the local foundation for that president, the Grover Cleveland Foundation or whatever it is. Yeah, they lay a wreath. If you ever go to Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, 10 minutes from there, if you like movies and you like history, see, again, I didn't just go see graves. I saw cool stuff. Is the home where they filmed The Christmas Story. You know the movie A Christmas Story, Ralphie? The house is there. You can go see that. That's right around the corner from Garfield. And you can actually stay there. It's like a bed and breakfast. But if you stay there during Christmas time, it's like $3,000 a night. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
I just was gonna mention, didn't know there's a Congressional Medal of Honor buried in Middletown
Is it really?
who had served in the Confederate Army.
Wow.
And he got the Congressional Medal of Honor fighting the Indians during the Indian War.
Wow. Where is he? Do you know whereabouts he is?
Bayview?
Is it Bayview? Okay, I'll have to look it up. That's interesting. I didn't know that. That's terrific. I love that kind of stuff. That's incredible. Any other online? Tom? Anybody else? Real quick, anything? Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so very much.